I am in Alcolu, South Carolina. I'm in the same city where on March 23rd, 1944, 14-year-old George Stinney Jr. was arrested for the murders of 11-year-old Betty June Binnicker and 7-year-old Mary Emma Thames. And I'm also here to tell you a very uncomfortable truth about the situation at hand. And that is that George Stinney Jr. was not innocent. Alcolu is a very, very tiny town. Population is just a little over 400 people as I speak. Now, originally, this town was founded between 1885 and 1890 by D.W. Alderman. Alcolu was made simply as a town where D.W. Alderman's mills would be operating and people that worked for him would live on the property and company provided housing. Now, as you can see right now, I'm walking along the train tracks, and on the other side of the tracks right here is where the sawmill would be, and on this property is where the employees that work for the mills would live. What once started as a simple sawmill quickly grew into different operations. You had a hosiery mill, then they built a flooring mill. The Aldermans even built a hotel. They had a gas station, a grocery store, a very, very tiny town that had basically nothing in it, all of a sudden has all of the aforementioned. They have a church and they have a school for the employees of the Alderman's mills. In the earlier part of the 20th century, people that came to work for the Alderman's mills that lived on the property were not paid in cash. They were paid in a coin that was pressed here called a babbit. It was a metal coin with the letter A stamped on it. Now, you would get paid in babbits, and then you could use that money or babbits for whatever it is that you wanted. Now, let's not forget, at the turn of the 20th century, there really isn't much doing out here. Nobody has a car. I mean, these people are poor that are working for the mill. Yeah, you're providing housing, but they're probably taking that out in terms of labor. So you basically are not getting free rent. And with this babbit coin that you would get paid in, you would buy groceries, you would get a haircut. If you had to go to the doctor, you would pay the doctor in babbit. As a matter of fact, this building right here, this was the old grocery store. This was where you would go buy your food or what have you, and you would pay the store in babbit. And all this right here in the back, which is no longer here, were schools, was a church. There was even a 200-seat theater where people would come and perform shows, or you could come here and watch a movie. You didn't have a car, so you couldn't go very far. So in a sense, the Aldermans had a very successful operation because you had no choice. You couldn't go anywhere. This is a memorial for D.W. Alderman and his wife Martha, founders of Alcolu, August 17th, 1888. That in all things Christ might have the preeminence. It says on the stone that it claims that you're a Christian. However, I don't know if it's very Christian-like to pay your employees in a made-up currency called babbit. What you were doing in a sense, is keeping them trapped in this little tiny town where they couldn't go anywhere. You're not paying your employees money. You're paying them in some useless currency that they could only use in this very building right here. Not very Christian-like, in my personal opinion. Later on, however, they got rid of the Babbitt system, and one of his employees that came to work for the Alderman family at the sawmill was a man by the name of George Stinney Jr. The Stinney family originally was from New York. They moved down here believing that there was a better opportunity to make a better way of life. Maybe they wanted to get out of a bad neighborhood. The company provided housing for George and his 5 children: Johnny, George Jr., Charles, Catherine, and the youngest being Amy. Amy was named after George's wife, Amy. She also, I believed, worked at a school that was provided by the mill for the black children of the community. And all of this would have been right between these trees, right past this train track, where everybody that lived in Alcolu, both white and black, would come here to work, basically from sunup to sunset. Now you see these train tracks right here. You'll see in a lot of articles that these people call themselves historians, and they will say that the train tracks literally divided the town. Black people on one side, white people on the other. However, some residents that lived here back in those days that were still alive when they were being interviewed said that wasn't necessarily true. Now, you could say that this was the black side or the poorer side of the tracks, but that's where the company provided housing was. And most people that lived in the company provided housing practically all worked at the mill in some form or fashion, or they worked in the grocery store, or they worked in the movie theater. They worked in some form or fashion for the aldermans. And then you had on the other side of the tracks, you had the quote-unquote white side. Now, back in those days, and even today, this town has been primarily half black, half white. However, people do say that there were white people that lived on, quote, the other side of the tracks, and they lived in the company provided housing. May have not been very much, but they lived there. And yes, in those days, a very segregated town where the Stinneys moved from New York to Alcolu, South Carolina. Some would say they might have moved back in time. This is the mill site where the Stinney family worked and where they lived, along with their 5 children, including George Jr. Now, the original mill, I believe, was sold in either 1946 or 1947, and I believe what I'm looking at can possibly be a new construction. I am not sure. Don't hold me to it. But this is the site where the Stinney family lived, and of course, again, where they worked. Currently, I am walking up the Green Hill Missionary Baptist Cemetery. This is where the Stinney family would come to worship every Sunday. This is where every black family that lived in Alcolu would worship every Sunday. Because if you were black, you weren't allowed to go to the white churches. Not very Christian, if you ask me. One of those guys over there, he was born in Alcolu. He told me that this guy, Tony Young Jr., was pretty good friends with George Stinney. Now, when he told me that, I thought it was a little bit odd because George was about 14 years old at the time that everything occurred, and this man would have been 10. So you have to wonder, what is a 14-year-old doing hanging around with a 10-year-old? Well, let's not forget, George Stinney was very small for his size. He was only 5'1" and did not even weigh 100 pounds. As you can see in his pictures, he's a very slight kid. You would think that George Stinney Jr., if he's not a very big person, he would possibly get along better with people that were closer to his size, maybe a little bit younger. Simply just a theory to me. I don't know if that's actually true or not. Just a thought, really. On these very train tracks, right in back of the Clarendon Baptist Church, you're going to see a picture of a man, a local historian, Mr. Frierson. And he's standing on these tracks because these tracks is where on March 23rd, 1944, George Stinney Jr. had a chance encounter with two young girls, 11-year-old Betty June Binnicker and her friend, 7-year-old Mary Emma Thames, that would alter his life forever. George and his sister were taking the family cow to go graze right around here yonder. And as they ran into these girls, the older one, Betty, approaches George and asks him if he had seen any maypops. A maypop is a type of a flower. And assuming they wanted to pick some because they're pretty. And George said, "Nah, I haven't seen any maypops." And Betty and Mary, they went down their merry way. George and his sister, they went to go let their cow graze for a while. Then they came back from yonder, walked these same tracks back to where they lived on the sawmill property over past that tree line. According to George and his sister Amy, they have never seen these kids ever in their lives. Remember, 1944, the rural South, segregation, Jim Crow laws, black children and white children are not allowed to play with each other. So it is very possible that even in a town with so few people that Alcolu had back in those times, it was not rare to actually run into another child of a different race that you had never seen before. Later on that very evening, word is being quickly spread in the Alcolu area that two little girls who had went looking for maypops hadn't arrived home before it got dark. Word is quickly spread, and a search party is formed. We're looking for Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames. So the search party is about between 1 and 200 men. One of those very men being George Stinney Jr. So all through these woods right here, all through the woods over here, darkness has fallen, and you have dozens and dozens and dozens of men shouting these little girls' names. The evening turns into the late evening, 11, 12, 1 o'clock in the morning, and they still have not been found. We are about 500 yards in the back of the Green Hill Missionary Baptist Church Cemetery. So the following morning, March 24th, 1944, just as the sun was coming up, searchers found the bodies of Betty and Mary right in this wooded area right here. Let me try to describe the crime scene as what was written in a couple of the articles online. So both of the girls were found on their backs with very, very vicious head wounds. One of the girls had a 2-inch cut over her right eye. And one of the girls, the back of her skull was completely crushed. It was crushed to the point where it was no longer a skull, but simply just fragments. This was a very, very vicious beating, a very horrific death that these two little girls suffered. Also, one of the witnesses that was in the search party remarked that even though the injuries were very horrific, there wasn't a whole lot of blood at the scene. Kind of odd. Reportedly around that time that the searchers found the bodies of Betty and Mary, reportedly somebody had called the Clarendon County Sheriff's Department and told them that George Stinney Jr. was seen the previous day with his sister at the train track where I just showed you, talking to the girls. Now, immediately, if you're a police officer and you're a normal person, you're going to want to talk to George because you're going to want to see if he's seen somebody else talking to the girls. Did you see the girls going into somebody's vehicle? You basically just want to talk to them to see what information that they could tell you that could lead to the murderer of these two poor little girls. But apparently, when you are a police officer and possibly a racist police officer, deputy sheriff, if you will, then you're gonna go to the Stinney house with a ulterior motive. So you have a couple sheriff's deputies who get in their car and they start heading over to the Stinney family home, which sits on the other side of this church on the grounds of the mill. They go into the home and they grab George Jr. and they grab his older brother, Johnny. Now, at that time, Johnny wasn't living with the family anymore. He was living with his grandmother, and he was preparing to enlist in the United States military. So they grab George and Johnny, take him down to the sheriff's office. They separate them, and, well, here's the problem. There is no written transcript of what took place. There's only the words of George Stinney Jr., if you want to believe them, basically confessing to the murder. Whether it was coerced, whether George Stinney Jr. actually committed the murder, as of right now, remains to be seen. Wait a minute. Did you just hear what you thought you heard? Did you just hear me indicate that possibly George Stinney Jr. could have committed these murders? Yeah, that's right, I said it. And I'll say it again. George Stinney Jr. could have committed the murders. He could have. Do I have proof that he did? No. There is no proof that he did. And it's very odd for me to say this, but there's really no proof that he did it. See, here's the problem. When George Stinney Jr. was arrested, the cops indicated that he confessed to the crime within 40 minutes of him arriving at the sheriff's department. Now, if you didn't commit a crime, why would you admit to doing something so heinous when you had nothing to do with it at all? So, as best as I can come up with, this is what George Stinney Jr. confessed to doing. My, that's pretty horrific. That's disgusting and foul. I can't believe George Stinney did that. Well, maybe he should be executed. But wait a minute. He was 14 years old. He couldn't have possibly have done that. He was only 5'1", and he weighed only 90 pounds. Well, maybe 95, wearing wet boots. He was a very small kid, very small for his age. So he couldn't have possibly have picked up the weapon that used to commit those murders. Oh, by the way, what was the weapon? Well, during the trial, there's really no transcripts of the court case now, is there? No, there really is no murder weapon. Well, according to the medical examiner, when he did the autopsy, he couldn't confirm whether the murder weapon was according to George Stinney Jr., he said he used a railroad spike that was about 14 inches long. Or maybe he used a linchpin. It's that little pin that you use to connect the train's cars together. Could have used that. But according to the medical examiner, the marks that were left on the girl indicated that it was more than likely a hammer, because the marks that were made against their skulls were circular in nature. But George Stinney Jr. didn't say that he hit them with a hammer. Supposedly, he said he hit them with a railroad spike. Or did he? Well, I don't know. Oh, by the way, hey, George, I'm checking out your clothes. Yeah, they're pretty clean. Your mother must love you. She must wash your clothes every day. Guys, let's not forget, this family was poor. George Stinney Jr. probably at best has 3 pairs of pants and 2 shirts. His mother's constantly washing their clothes because they're poor. They don't have any. So wouldn't you think that he would have clothes that are covered in blood? Where are these clothes at? Well, they damn sure weren't in the courtroom during the trial, because that would have been included in the evidence. Oh, but yeah, well, we don't have the bloody clothes. You would think that given such a vicious, murderous beating to two girls, that his clothes would be covered in blood. Well, there were no bloody clothes, unless he took his clothes and threw them away. Yeah, that's it. That's exactly what he did. He took his clothes and maybe he burned them. Maybe he threw them away. Maybe he gave them to the Salvation Army. Who knows? But then his mother would probably notice this. Like I said, they're poor. Hey, George, where's your pants? Where's your brown pants at? I don't know. But that never came up. That never came up at all during the trial. And right now, we're going to go for a 10-minute drive down to the Clarendon County Courthouse. I'm going to show you where this, in my opinion, this sham of a trial took place. On April 26, 1944, 14-year-old George Stinney Jr. goes on trial, being accused of double murder. He's facing the electric chair at the age of 14 years old. Back in those days, when you were 14, you were considered an adult. So if you committed an adult crime, you're going to get a very, very adult sentence. Now, when George Stinney Jr. walks into the courtroom, he looks at the jury box and notices it looks like the 1923 outfield of the World Series, a bunch of white guys. Now, you're supposed to be judged by a jury of your peers, but that doesn't look that way according to George there. So during the trial, his attorney, court-appointed attorney, Charles Plowden, didn't call any witnesses for George's defense. He didn't cross-examine any of the witnesses for the prosecution. He didn't do much of anything. See, Charles, he was running for a seat in the House of Representatives. And, you know, it really wouldn't look good if he was defending a killer. You know, because obviously George Stinney Jr. committed this crime. I mean, the evidence is overwhelming. And even though a bunch of letters, hundreds of letters came in from all over the country, from people begging for George Stinney Jr.'s, you know, for them to not sentence him to death, to just like give him life, or at least, you know, commute a sentence, what have you. Mr. Johnston, the governor of South Carolina at the time, who was running for re-election, he can't be bothered with any nonsense. I mean, obviously this kid, he did it. And, well, where's the evidence? Again, there really wasn't any evidence. Well, he confessed. Well, do you have the transcript of his confession? Transcript. No, we don't have that. But no, what he said, I wrote on my notepad. Ah, okay. Wrote it on your notepad. Now, some of you might be asking, wouldn't there be at least an audio recording of his confession? Well, back in those days, there was no tape recorders. That was still some science fiction stuff. Now, you know, a police department, a sheriff's department, they could get a phonograph and have the audio recorded onto a record. Could do that. But the problem with that is, once you make a mistake while you're recording on a record, the record's no good. You gotta throw it away and start all over again. That's why it wasn't practical for just recording things like that. So the prosecution, they call their witnesses, one of them being the man that performed the autopsy on the girls. Now, as I showed you earlier, the motive for George Stinney Jr. supposedly committing this murder, well, the medical examiner, he didn't really find any evidence of any sexual assault. Nah, he didn't really find any. I mean, he thought there could be some bruising there, but I don't know. Maybe they were riding their bicycles. I don't know. Now, he did talk about the marks on the girls' faces, amongst those being little Mary Emma Thames had that 2-inch gash above her eye, and she had, it almost looked like a borehole in the front of her skull. Now, could a kid, George Stinney Jr., could he inflict those types of wounds? Me personally, of course he could. He damn well could have. With that railroad spike that he said he used to commit the crime. Kind of looks like this. I found this at the train tracks. Now, according to George's supposed, confession, he said he used this. But it was long. It was like 14 inches long. So, in theory, a 14-year-old could weld something that weighs less than 2 pounds and just savagely beat 2 girls to death. But, like I said, the medical examiner said that whatever object was used to inflict the wounds on the girls had a rounded head. So maybe it could have been this. Maybe he used this. Who knows? I don't even know what this is. Leave a comment below. Let me know what this is. I have no idea. However, there was no murder weapon found. There was no bloody clothes. There was only a confession. A coerced confession. Hey, George, if you tell us what you did, we'll let you go home. Come on, kid. How about it? How about another bowl of ice cream on the house? I'll even let you pick the flavor this time. Well, this sham of a trial took all but 2 hours, and the jury went into deliberations for all of 10 minutes. And I bet you 9 minutes and 30 seconds of it were talking about what they were gonna have for dinner that night. So that very same day, April 26, 1944, George Stinney Jr. is found guilty of double murder, and he is sentenced to die by the judge. By the judge. This is where the trial took place, right over here. This courthouse, I believe, was redone a few years ago, so this doesn't actually look like the original courthouse, of course. I think it resembles it, but can you imagine on that day when George Stinney Jr. is probably scared out of his mind? And this is the biggest story in South Carolina that summer. And there was literally, they would estimate about 1,500 people packed in the building, packed outside, just waiting for somebody to step outside that door and scream guilty or not guilty. And they wanted blood. They had bloodlust in their eyes. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention, during the medical examiner's testimony, he said that the girls did not have any kind of defensive wounds on them. If somebody is going to be attacking you with a blunt object like a hammer or some kind of heavy-fisted object, your first reaction, of course, like me. Yet, he said there were no wounds, no defensive wounds. That's why I always try to read as much as I can about these cases, because one article will always change it up over another. But then George Stinney Jr.'s, his confession, he said that he whacked the younger one first and then went for Betty June. Now, if you're Betty and you just seen that this psycho just bashed your friend's skull in, aren't you gonna run? Wouldn't you have wounds on your back or on your shoulder or on your sides or on your arms? So I can't unequivocally say, without a shadow of a doubt, that there were no defensive wounds. Maybe they lied. I have no idea. Stories like this that take place so many years ago, things change. People's minds fade. They don't remember things the way they remembered them 80 some odd years ago. So who knows if the medical examiner was telling the truth or not. Before we go to George Stinney Jr.'s final resting place, I want to show you this memorial that was placed on somebody's private property. George Stinney Jr., October 21st, 1929 to June 6, 1944. Illegally executed. You know what? So, I don't want to use the word odd, but just a travesty, if you will, is that the cemetery where George is buried did not allow them to put this memorial on their grounds. As a matter of fact, there really wasn't any cemeteries in the area that I believe would allow them to place it on their grounds. That's why the people right here in this house, they decided to just go ahead and put it on their property. These are the graves of George and Amy Stinney. These are George Jr.'s parents. And these kind folk at the cemetery, because George's grave was lopsided, and they just fixed it, so that's why you see the sand, because this is a sand cemetery. That's what we're walking on right now, so they fixed it so it's nice and even, so it looks a lot better. So I would appreciate that. I did not ask them to do that. They just went ahead and did that, so. We're at the Calvary Baptist Church Cemetery here in Pinewood, South Carolina. And this is the cemetery where after George's execution, he was laid to rest. I was here about 2 years ago looking feverishly for his grave, but to no avail. And coming to find out, doing a little bit of reading, his parents did not want George to have a grave marker because they were afraid that possibly somebody would come and vandalize his grave. And of course, this place being one of the churches that didn't want the memorial placed on the grounds. Now, I can understand why they might not have wanted it here, simply for the fact they probably don't want to turn this place into some kind of shrine or a memorial or a tourist attraction. Now, if I was in charge of the church, I'm pretty sure I would have just let them go ahead and put it here. But he's buried somewhere here in an unmarked grave, and we could only begin to guess where this grave is. I looked all around here for about 30 minutes looking for any kind of a clue or what have you, and I see nothing. Usually graves like that would be buried maybe at the edge of the cemetery, and quite possibly he could be buried there, but however, nobody knows. And this cemetery is not very well taken care of. I don't think this place has had any new burials in a very, very long time, and it is in bad need of cleaning up. Most of the graves that I see here that are marked are from at least 80 to 100 plus years ago. I am led to guess that even if the church had the plans of where exactly he's buried, I don't even think those records exist anymore. I don't even think if they wanted to find them, they could. Lots of places like this, they keep very sloppy records of who's buried here. Even though the cemetery is not very big, something like that could easily be lost. This is our final stop. This is the Smoke Family Cemetery. And this is where Betty June Binnicker was laid to rest. A very, very vicious murder. This would be her older brother. He died when he was a baby. And her parents are buried right next to her. I wasn't sure how to end the video because this has always been an unusual story. In the fact that, number one, a 14-year-old boy was executed, and later on, he was his conviction was vacated. And the popular thought is that, number one, George Stinney Jr. was innocent and he was wrongfully executed. And popular thought is that he was exonerated. Well, he wasn't exonerated. and he was not found innocent. That would be in the popular thought of the public at large. Me personally, I feel that he did not commit the murders. Of course, I wasn't there. I'm a very analytical person when it comes to just reading stories and stuff like that. Most people nowadays, they think with two different things, three different things. Number one, people think with their brain, but a lot more people think with their heart and their skin color. And nobody was there at the time. So it's easy for us to say, oh, George Stinney Jr. was totally innocent. Well, I ask you guys, number one, what was the proof that he committed a crime other than his confession? And there wasn't any. And then I would ask, what is the proof of his innocence? And well, there isn't any. And anybody out there who thinks that a 14-year-old is not capable of committing this crime, in my opinion, they are wrong. Now, before you guys start passing judgment on me and what have you, allow me to confess something. I could be quite a jaded person. I read a lot of these types of stories, these horrible crimes that were committed against the elderly, against people, against children. And after a while, you read so many stories about 13-year-olds and 12-year-olds killing people and stabbing people and shooting people. Number one, I feel, and I know for a fact, that George Stinney Jr. was totally railroaded, and this case was brought a lot about by race. And it just was, because that's how things were back then. And we don't even have a confession that was believed. I don't even think he wrote it himself. It might have been signed by him, but this was no trial at all. This was a very unfair trial. And a lot of people, as much digging in as I was trying to do about this story, most people were just pleading with the governor of South Carolina, I think his name was Olin Johnston, to just at least commute his sentence to life. There wasn't a lot of people believing that he was innocent, because back in those days, when you admitted that you committed a murder, well, guess what? You're going to believe somebody, because their thought is that, well, why would somebody confess to a murder that they didn't commit? Well, we don't know what they were telling George. We don't know if they were telling him, hey, listen, if you confess to this crime, everything will be okay and you get to go home. I'm sure they were doing a lot about that. I'm sure the slime balls that arrested him, they didn't really care to do any kind of real investigation on this crime. You had a very small town. 2 little girls were brutally murdered, and somebody somewhere somehow said, oh yeah, I seen him talking to the girls. I don't know. My final thoughts on this, there was always a rumor going around Alcolu about a man named George Burke. He was the man who owned the property where the little girl's body is buried, who had a son named George Burke Jr. He died, I want to say, a few years after this murder was committed, and there was a rumor that the 2 girls were last seen jumping into George Burke Jr.'s truck, because he was a truck driver. He would haul lumber for his dad, who worked for the mill. And there was a couple interviews in a local newspaper about somebody who was really old, who lived in Alcolu, who said that they seen, Betty and Mary jumping in his truck, and possibly he might be the one who murdered them. And a lot of people in Alcolu, believe that George Burke Jr. was the one who actually committed the crime, but we don't know. We don't know why this crime was committed. We don't know truly who did it. But unfortunately, in the law's eye, George Stinney Jr., even though the conviction was vacated, he in fact legally is not innocent. I don't know if they could have legally have done that, but who knows? I wasn't there, and neither was anybody watching this video. So just a tragedy all the way around. So Rest in peace to George Jr., Betty, and Mary. Like I said, at the end of the day, I think with my brain, and it is what it is. Okay, guys, I am out of here. I hope you enjoyed the video, and let me know in the comments what you think. I'll catch up with you guys later. Peace out.